So first of all, good morning or good afternoon to everyone joining today for this very exciting session organized by the Swedish Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, as well as with the within the Sustainability Committee of Swedcham. So my name is Karine Hirn. I'm the Vice Chair of the Swedish Chamber of Commerce, an active member of the Sustainability Committee, and also in my spare time, a partner at East Capital, which is an investor in mainly in equity markets. And when you're an investor, you always have to think about what's going on in terms of trends in the world and try to foresee in terms of growth and value drivers. And that's why I think today's seminar's topic is extremely exciting, the future of food, because there's a lot going on. And it's also very exciting because we will be debating about that with two experts, which I'm very happy to present today to you. So one is in Hong Kong, one is in Sweden. So just this is a perfect way, by the way, to set the stage for a Swedish Chamber of Commerce event. And so if I start with Daniel, Daniel is head of strategy and special project at Stockholm Dreamery. It's a Sweden-based startup developing the world's most ambitious cheese without milk. I've never tried it, but I just heard from Sonalie that it's absolutely excellent. And now I'm really hoping that I can try that soon. Daniel is also a mentor of a few food tech accelerators, an operating expert to 3 food tech venture cap funds, an advisor to at least 10 food tech startups in Europe, North America, and Africa. And this maybe are the things you know about him, but one thing you might not know is that Daniel once owned 3 camels in Somalia. And he called the first one Camel Chameleon, the second one King Arthur of Camelot, and the third one was Camel Ron Diaz. Then we have Sonalie joining us from Hong Kong, known to many and to me as Green Queen. I'm a big fan of Green Queen, by the way. So Green Queen, Sonalie, you are the founder and editor-in-chief of Asia's first and largest impact media news platform covering everything sustainability. She's also the founder of Eco Warehouse, the world's largest certified organic food sourcing platform. She's launching the world's first green packaging sourcing marketplace. And then on weekends, you can find Sonalie with her family hiking Hong Kong's mountain trails, experimenting on plant-based recipes. And if you are like me, always curious and want to explore all kinds of things, you need to also follow what Sonalie does, because she's a long-time home cook. She has co-written 2 cookbooks, and she always comes up with very interesting recipes, of course, of sustainable food. So Daniel and Sonalie, we know the reason why we are here today. As I was talking about, exciting, lots going on in this space. But there is another reason, is the fact that we do need to care about our planet. And food has been identified as one sector or one factor, which is the way it's being managed today and driven is not sustainable. So I'm going to ask maybe Daniel, you start by telling us more about and setting the stage for why is this an issue today. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. It's great to meet you all today. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about the food system. So everyone producing, distributing, consuming foods, all of us, what the issues are, what some solutions are. We're getting into the solutions later, actually. I don't need to go into my background. I do a lot of stuff, all things food tech, accelerators, VCs, startups world. I also have a newsletter called Food Tech Weekly. Great. So setting the stage, when we produced or when we built the modern food system after the Second World War, we had this laser focus on cheap calories and high yields. And the reason for that is that the default for humanity was famines and starvation and undernutrition. We always had that. And even by the end of the Second World War, I think around 50% of the world population was undernourished. So when we built the modern food system, we focused everything, including subsidies and R&D and regulatory, and everything was focused on cheap calories because we wanted to eradicate hunger. And of course, a big driver was that we knew that the global population was going to grow, so we needed to feed more people. And there was this huge fear that we weren't going to be able to feed the world population. And they were right in the way that the world population did increase 2.5 times between 1960 and today. So from 3 to 7.5 billion people. So, but luckily we had a lot of innovation in the food system. This is Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, with irrigation machinery, fertilizers, and then hybrid seeds and so on. We were able to feed millions and actually billions of people. He's credited with saving 1 billion people from starvation. He was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his work. So helping companies like India, Pakistan, Mexico, Philippines, and so on become self-sufficient and exporters. And on the top slide here, you can actually see that, yes, the population did increase, but we increased production much faster, meaning that we were able to reduce the rate of undernutrition in the world. So today it's around 10%, maybe a bit more due to COVID, around 800 million people, but we are winning the war against hunger. At the same time, in the last decades, consumers have adopted pretty unhealthy diets in the Western world, and the way we produce foods is not sustainable, meaning that the way we're meeting our needs is jeopardizing the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Here's another example, dietary risk. So if we look at risk factors for disease and disability and premature death, it used to be tobacco, air pollutions, alcohol, traffic accidents, things like that. Today, poor nutrition, or rather poor dietary patterns, is the #1 risk factor for disease and disability and premature death. Diabetes is one example, which is booming globally, sadly. We have high BMI, high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. It's all diet related. And we even know why. We were over-consuming certain things like salt, sugar, red processed meats, fatty acids, saturated fats, trans fats. We know the bad stuff we shouldn't consume as much of. But the big issue is actually we're under-consuming all the healthy stuff, the blue bars here. So fruits, vegetables, seeds and nuts, legumes, pulses, fish or omega-3s, and whole grains. And this is a main reason why we have this explosion in non-communicable disease. Then there's the environmental issues. The food system is responsible for 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions, for 70% of freshwater use, for most of vegetated land use. It's the main culprit of biodiversity loss, and so on. So it's having a huge impact on the global environment. Not to mention the animals. We're using billions of animals each year to satisfy our food needs. This has issues. As we all know, we're living through a pandemic, which was likely caused by a food choice. There's the risk of antibiotic resistance and so on, linked to the way we raise animals for food. We slaughter 66 billion chickens each year for food. So that's one example. I mean, the numbers are pretty staggering. So if you look at what the food system needs, it's really 3 things. Yes, we need to continue to increase ag productivity in certain regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, going from 1 to 4 billion people this century. We need to reduce food waste and food loss. Around 30% of the food we buy in rich countries is discarded, not eaten. 30% or 40% of food in emerging markets, developing countries, doesn't reach the consumer due to poor supply chains, lack of cold chain, and so on. We also need to shift our dietary patterns towards those more nourishing and sustainable. And if you read the Eat Lancet report and other big reports, they will say the same things. Luckily, we have a lot of innovation that can help solve some of these issues, and I think we'll start discussing some of those now. So over to you.
Okay, very exciting. Daniel, may I ask already, will you be able to make these slides available for us?
Sure,
Because
I can
there were,
share a PDF afterwards, of course.
okay, great, because there were lots of good slides and you went fast through them, which I know that was me asking you to go fast. But so Sonalie, I mean, before we start going into what are the solutions, is there anything here that you would like to comment at, or anything else you'd like to share with us?
Actually, I really want to commend Daniel because I participate on a lot of panels and I talk about this all the time, but that was probably one of the best framings to start the discussion on alternative proteins. So this is my second panel today, and earlier I was of course asked the dreaded question about the processing of are alternative protein solutions healthy? And I think what Daniel has just done is he's really given you the full picture of the management of humanity's food systems. And a lot of times we think about things on a much more personal level, about what's on our plate, what's in our fridge, what's in our supermarket shelf. But Daniel's really come up and given you the macro view, which is so important. And the second thing I'd like to pull out from what he said, which is it's just absolutely key, and I couldn't agree more. Despite what you might think reading Green Queen, is that there is no one solution for everyone on Earth. And in a perfect world, we would be adapting everything based on, where someone is. But this is a globalized world with a semi-globalized kind of internet culture, if you exclude the Chinese ecosystem. And we need to be aware of the messaging that gets permeated through that global cultural system and economy and trade relationships. And that's why alternative proteins represent an important solution. So I think Daniel's done enough on why. The why is clear.
Okay, so let's go into the second part of our discussion today. So, what are the solutions? And you already said there's not just one solution, there are several. Can you just share with us?
So we need to feed people, and we need to find a way to do it that is environmentally friendly, and that is in the sense that we're not causing extra emissions or exacerbating the climate crisis. But we also need to find a way to do it so that it's food that has a lot of nutrition, and that's where the alternative protein name really came from. To be very honest with you, when I started writing about these companies in 2015, we weren't using that term, but this is the term that has come to represent all these this new generation of foods where people are really working to take the animals out of the food system. Okay. And again, there are plenty of arguments about regenerative agriculture and grazing and buffalo commons in the United States. And I don't necessarily want to get into that and we can talk about the challenges later, but at the end of the day, there's also an ethical question here, which is, do you believe that as a species, we should be consuming animals? And that's a personal question for everyone to answer. Okay. So I'm going to put that aside for now. I'm not going to talk about that question, because that's a whole different debate. And it really is personal based on your belief system. But what I am going to talk about is that the way that we produce animals today is not working. I mean, here we sit in the middle of a pandemic that can arguably be linked to the trouble with our livestock agriculture linked issues. But so what's happened is this whole new generation of scientists, founders, ecosystem makers, food companies, just future thinkers have started to go, right, people love meat, people love dairy, people love seafood. We need to give them options that are, they're going to they're going to enjoy from a taste point of view, from a texture point of view, they're going to work, they're going to be commercially viable in terms of being able to sell in stores or direct to consumer or through farms and used by chefs and home cooks alike and food preparation people. And we need to do it in a way that is good for the planet, because we've got this crisis. And so what's happened is this sort of massively burgeoning space of alternative proteins that sits under the greater space that is food technology. And that term will either excite you if you're a tech forward person, or it might scare you if you believe that food and tech should never be together. Although I would argue that unless you grow your own food and live on your own farm, you are interacting with food touched by technology every day anyway. So that's a mass apprehension. And so under this food technology kind of space, we've got these alternative proteins. And why protein? Because most of us eat animal foods for the protein, right? And to some extent the fat, but nobody wants to talk really about alternative fats except probably me and Daniel, because we think it's exciting. But alternative proteins, protein is the building block of our bodies. We need protein, although a lot of us in the Western world actually eat too much protein, but that's a different subject. But so we need these proteins and we need to produce them without animals. And so you've got these, I would say, 5 different verticals that have emerged under alternative proteins. So number 1 is, but smaller, but no less important. It's the whole foods plant-based proteins. So that's going to be like your mushrooms, your jackfruit, where you really can use the whole food to replicate the textures of meat. And this is where, things like hedgehog mushrooms and certain types of mushrooms that are maybe not as common in the West are really useful, because you can really cook them pretty much as is, and they have this meaty texture. Jackfruit is another really great option. Things like also tempeh, which is like a fermented soybean cake from Indonesia. So these are more like on the whole food section. So they're minimally processed in the sense that the ingredients tend to be closer to whole on the agricultural chain. Then you've got the most famous part of alternative proteins, which is plant-based meats and seafood and dairy. And that's basically where these are 2.0 plant-based meats. So it's going beyond things like vital wheat gluten and seitan, and really going into using technologies like wet moisture extrusion, which allows you to process soybean isolate or pea protein isolate or all kinds of kind of plant ingredients into a texture that is similar to meat. And of course, the most famous companies in this space would arguably be in Europe, the Vegetarian Butcher, in the US, Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat. And in Asia, that would be Omni Meat with the famous Omni Pork, which is from my hometown here in Hong Kong. Very proud of Green Monday for that. And then you've got another vertical that is also in the press a lot and talked about a lot, and that's going to be cellular agriculture, also referred to under different names like cultivated meat, cell-based meat, cell-cultured meat, synthetic meat, in lesser positive terms, lab-grown meat or in vitro meat, as the Japanese refer to it. So these are all terms for the same thing, which is basically, and I don't want to do a scientific dissertation on this, and Daniel probably will explain it better, but essentially you're taking the cell of an animal and you're basically putting it in a situation, you're using scaffolding and building blocks to grow tissue in a laboratory environment. They tend to be known as bioreactors. So that's cell-based meat, and that is not commercially available today. There are 2 places where you can actually eat cell-based meat. One is Israel. There's a restaurant of the startup called Super Meat. They basically have a booking system it's free, so there's no money exchange, and you can go taste their cell-based chicken, like their prime minister did, and many people in Israel. And then you've got in Singapore, which was the first country in the world to basically pass the regulatory hurdle and say that they were going to allow the commercialization of cell-based meat. And the American company Eat Just is the one that won the first regulatory approval worldwide and executed on the first commercial exchange. So selling their cell-based chicken for money. And that's available at 1880, the restaurant in Singapore.
And that's very recent, isn't it, Sonalie? I mean,
that is from December. Super Meat is from September. Just Meat in Singapore, Eat Just is Good Meat in Singapore is from December. So we are talking about, we are living in the future of food right now. It's happening. But just to be clear that right now, most cell-based meat companies are not at all ready for commercialization. The earliest we're looking at, and it will likely be seafood first, will be 2022, 2023. And even then it will probably be disseminated through high-end restaurants and chefs and not really be on the supermarket. But optimists believe that within 5 years, we will have cell-based meat on the supermarket. But when I say meat, I mean seafood as well, et cetera. And so that's cell-based. We can talk about the hurdles later, but obviously right now, it is not legally it is not regulated as of today, except in Singapore. So that's another issue that needs to happen, right? Along with the commercialization based on the technology. But I can tell you that investors are pouring money into this space. It's no surprise why people who love meat want meat. They don't want an imitation of meat or an analog of meat. And therefore they will, people say all kinds of stuff about, lab grown meat. People are not going to like it. I don't buy it. Once it's on the shelf and it's price parity, people who eat meat are going to buy meat, just like they don't care what's in their meat today. And that's a key part of the discussion that's missing in a lot of the either or situations. The meat you eat contains everything from pharmaceuticals to feces. That's the reality of the situation. People don't care. It's not on the label. And I think cell-based meat is going to kind of get to that point. So in the sense that it's going to be clean, but people are not going to care that it's cell-based. They're just going to care that they can eat their steak and that, great, an animal wasn't killed. It cost the same. Go team. And then the fourth vertical is referred to in different writing, but let's call it precision fermentation. It's also known as synthetic biology or recombinant protein technology. And essentially that's the hardest one, I think, to explain, in that it's the least well known. But let me use an analogy that is commonly used in this space, which is people who have type 1 diabetes need to put insulin in their body every day, inject insulin in their body. And it used to be that we would have to use dead pig's pancreas to get that insulin. And obviously that was costly and difficult and not great. And so eventually there was technology developed that allowed us to create synthetic insulin in a lab environment in order to help diabetic patients. So this is technology we know well, we already have it, and it is being repurposed by food technologists and entrepreneurs to basically use this technology and mimic, basically it's using animal DNA and then basically getting it mixed with things like yeast and other microflora and other kind of bacteria, and in a lab setting, recreating the same protein. So for example, there's a famous American company called Perfect Day, was invested in by Horizon Ventures, very famously. Perfect Day has used recombinant protein technology to create whey protein that is molecularly identical to animal whey protein. So it is animal protein, but it's animal free. It's dairy protein, sorry, but it's animal free. So just to be very clear, that if you were to consume Perfect Day's protein, which is used to make ice cream, for example, and in Hong Kong, we're very lucky that we have an ice cream company called Ice Age that is using the Perfect Day technology to make their ice cream, which is, again, animal-free dairy. If you are allergic to dairy, especially if you're allergic to whey protein, you will be allergic to this too, because it's molecularly identical. But unlike dairy, it does not contain lactose. They chose not to add that in because it's a common allergen. So just to be clear that it is identical on a molecular level to dairy, but it has no animal origins, unless you count the DNA.
Okay, and Sonalie, this fourth vertical, you said it's the least known. Is it because it's one of the most recent ones, or is it?
It's the most. So I have many discussions with many experts about this, and very honestly, the best answer that I can find is that it's just a newer. People have come to it later. It's just more newly embraced. There are about 10 companies in this space that I know of off the top of my head, most in the dairy space. So doing things like dairy, there's also the famous egg one. They're doing the same thing, but with eggs, that's Clara Foods. There's Formo in Europe, which is doing dairy. There's Change Foods, which is Australian and US doing this. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but Stockeld is also using fermentation in its products, but in a different way, not precision fermentation. So that's why fermentation is confusing, because there's bio-based fermentation, traditional fermentation, and synthetic biology, precision fermentation. But essentially, I am a big believer in this space, this fourth vertical. I think it is utilized right now, and I think it's going to be massive because let's face it, cheese is addictive. People love cheese. It's very, I think there's a lot of potential there. So, but it is the least known, and the funding is getting stronger, but it is one of the least funded. Cell-based and plant-based are much more funded. And then the fifth vertical, which
there's a fifth one.
There is a fifth one, but I will let Daniel speak about it because I personally don't believe in it. Sorry. It's insect protein. There are many pros for it, and I think Daniel is better equipped to talk to you about it.
All right, well, let's go over and speak insects with Daniel. But just regarding the fourth one, do you guys like Star Trek? Were you watching Star Trek before?
Of course.
Isn't it what's happening? They're like ordering something and they get the burger. It's like almost like 3D printing of food. That would be my, no?
Yes.
Not
and
really?
No.
Okay, let's not go.
You can use fermentation technology in 3D printing, but you can also use cellular agriculture in 3D printing, and you can also use plant-based. And so 3D printing is its own thing, and it's definitely part of the food technology landscape, but not necessarily linked to one of these four verticals.
Okay. So sorry to everybody for confusing.
No, not at all. Not at
all.
But
okay, let's go talk about insects, Daniel.
Sure, and I think it's important to keep in mind that 2 billion people all over the world already consume insects as a regular source of protein and food. From Africa to Asia to the Gulf countries, considered a delicacy. I think what's new is that insects are now considered this alternative protein source in animal feed, because the way we produce animal feed is, surprise, surprise, not sustainable. We're using the most biodiverse place on the planet, Brazil, to produce animal feed, soy, for the rest of the world. And we're using a lot of fish for fish meal and fish oil, around 4 million tons of fish meal and fish oil. Problem is, we can't scale that up. It peaked 20 years ago. So the industry has been looking for alternatives to conventional animal feed, which is more sustainable environmentally. So the 3 biggest fields are algae, single-cell proteins, and insects. And there are a couple of big actors that have built big factories to produce insects as animal feed. In Europe, we have Insect, have raised hundreds of millions of euros. There's Protix in the Netherlands. Insect is in France. In the UK, there's Entocycle, South Africa's AgriProtein. So there's more and more companies are building these huge factories to produce insects as animal feed for use in aquaculture or for poultry and so on. Insects are part of the natural diet of many animals. Obviously, if you don't believe in consumption of animals, this is of course a dead end, because if you believe that, some people believe that plant-based and fermentation-based and cell-based protein will sort of crowd out conventional protein, then investing in conventional animal production, including animal feed, is sort of a dead end. It could become a stranded asset. So animal feed is one part. The second part is there are a lot of companies, hundreds of companies worldwide, working on insects as human food. There's Hargol in Israel. There's a lot of them in North America. Problem is, from a regulatory point of view, for example, in Europe, it hasn't been allowed. There are some novel foods application pending. One was just approved for yellow mealworm, I think. So basically, there are some obstacles in terms of technology to scale this up, and regulatory, and I think especially consumer acceptance, because there's this huge yuck factor for consumers to eat insects, whether eating them whole or eating them as protein in bread or smoothies or protein shakes or whatever. Most people, however, seem to be okay that we feed insects to animals and then eat the eggs or something, because again, insects are part of the natural diet of many animals, so people have less of an issue there. But I think it really, we'll see whether people in the Western world will adopt insects as food. As feed, it already seems to be happening. But again, if Sonalie's hypothesis that people will shift to alternative proteins such as plant-based, cell-based, fermentation-based is correct, then that route is a dead end. So that's a very quick intro to that field.
Okay, but very interesting. So we now have 5 verticals, and you were mentioning already a number of like very interesting features regarding the technology, the innovation. But let's now move on and go a little bit deeper into the challenges, because I mean, really, Daniel, again, I second. I echo Sonalie, your intro was spot on to understand that we need to do something, and then we've gone through the solutions. But what are the challenges? And I would like to say, for me, as being just somebody curious about the topic and an avid reader of your newsletters, but otherwise very still, I mean, looking for more knowledge, I can see that there are probably some real challenges, and then there are some created challenges. And part of the created challenges, by the way, probably being fed by the propaganda from the other side. Like if you're a big dairy or a big meat producer, you don't want to make anybody want to change. So we might also want to discuss that. But I'm thinking, for instance, to start with, you go like, okay, we are in Sweden or in Hong Kong. We can afford going to the shop and going to eat this, a great ice age ice cream. But in many places around the world, this is not a question. It's just being fed, and getting. So in terms of my first question will be, for instance, regarding affordability. And what's the trend there? Probably, the more we invest, the least expensive it will be. But if you could comment on that. So affordability, availability, my first question. And the second question is more related to health. You mentioned it, this issue like, well, I don't know how good this is. Do I really want to have like a lab, ultra processed kind of stuff? I don't even understand what it's made of. So, who wants to start?
Sonalie?
I'm happy to start. So there are so many challenges, and I think Daniel and I have touched on many of them already, but we can just reline them up, and they are different depending on the vertical. So I think Daniel's already done a really good job of telling you the challenges for insect protein. And I agree with him on so many of those points. I'm a slaughter-free publication. That's why I don't speak to insect protein, but he's right on everything he said. And so that we've covered that. I think for cell-based, there are probably some of the biggest challenges because right now we're just not scaled up technology-wise, right? We would need to get to the point where there would be a bioreactor in, let's say, almost every city, and that's going to take time and probably government investment and money. And just, there's also issues in terms of the different types of meat that are being produced in terms of like whether it's tissue or muscle or kind of whole pieces, and like a steak is much harder than like just a piece of tissue. It's just different because of the things like the marbling and the fat and everything. So there's those challenges. There's the challenge, as you say, of the fact that the media keeps referring to it as lab grown, which disgusts people, which is a real shame because speaking just once again, like whether you're growing the tissue in the animal or in the bioreactor, it's still animal tissue. So if you're comfortable eating meat grown in a tiny CAFO pen, I don't really understand why it would be so different for you to eat it from a lab. It's just a much more humane, cruelty-free way to do it. So there is that issue. There's the whole kind of marketing of it, explaining it, etc., like nutritional labels, classification. That work hasn't been done. There are some great ecosystem players and alliances all over the world that are working on that with governments, but governments have a long way to go to even understand what it is. I mean, I know I'm half French, and our government, just went ahead and said, well, no, in France there'll never be any cellular agriculture, which is just ridiculous. But that's a problem, right? So education, kind of awareness, under explaining the technology. There's going to be a huge amount of work there. Obviously, the regulatory challenges are there, and the cost challenges are there because it requires so much R&D that price parity is a long way off, depending on who you're talking to. On the other side of the health coin, I just want to be clear that cell-based meat is still meat. So whatever issues that you have with meat, once you take out the antibiotics issue, the pharmaceutical issue, the hormone issue, the excess species issue. So all this stuff that's in your meat now that you eat happily but don't think about, that's going to be out of the cell-based meat plate. But you're still going to have issues of if you eat too much meat, it could cause heart disease or whatever. All that stuff doesn't really go away. So it's still meat. So that, I mean, I don't want to lie about that, you know, whereas, for example, plant-based meat isn't technically animal meat, right? It's an alternative in the true sense of the word. And so, you know, for example, one of the big benefits that no one talks about when they talk about how processed it is, oh, well, the fact that plant-based meat has lots of fiber, which most of us are heavily deficient in, especially in the global north and Western countries. And that has caused us to have huge gut problems. And then we spend time buying things like Activia to make our, you know, gut flora better, but we've missed out the point of the fiber. So there is this kind of misconception that, you know, all plant-based meats are super processed and all plant-based products are super processed. And that's a huge misconception to get through. I mean, literally every panel I do, I get that question. I figured out how to answer it in a way that makes people reframe it, but it's just that's very, very much there, you know. I think food is, the biggest challenges for me remain hugely systemic, which is that food is personal, food is cultural, food is your identity, you know, food is your national culture. Food is your grandma at the stove or your dad at the barbecue or I don't know, your mom making you soup when you're sick. It's just the most primal, hugely kind of defining thing as part of lives, and it's not optional. Food, unlike many other things, is something, you know, that needs to be part of your life because you need to eat to survive. And for some people that might mean a Soylent shake, which is sad to think about for me, but that, you know, you need sustenance. You can't just survive forever with no food. So it's never going to go away. And as such, it attached to that are huge issues around, you know, identity and production and for example, agriculture has played a huge role in human history, and farmers are a key part of the narrative we tell ourselves about our food systems. So what do we do with all the farmers? And we need to kind of divert them and upskill them and retrain them if they're willing to, you know, go, instead of growing, you know, instead of managing dairy farms, they could switch to oat milk like they do in California, or instead of growing chickens in coops, they can start growing mushrooms like they've done in the UK in some pilot programs. So there's all these kind of other challenges as well. Like then it's like, what do we do with all the animals that are currently on the planet, the hundreds of billions of them? So
well, we would, I guess.
So I mean, do we eat them all eventually? Like, where do we go from there? So there are a lot of challenges across the different verticals. With fermentation, I think the challenge is going to be around the GM question, and around the fact that we need more companies doing this. And again, it's going to be similar to the cell-based, where it's going to feel like it was made in a lab. So there's all these challenges that are coming at the same time. And then finally, you asked about price parity and affordability. I think I'm less concerned about that, especially for plant-based meat, because prices have already come down a huge amount. And as we scale, it's very clear that you can get cheaper, right? And don't forget that meat and seafood are subsidized to the tune of, I think if you put them together, almost $100 billion a year. So those subsidies could easily be redeployed if we wanted to, if there was a will towards that. So I think we have artificially cheap animal protein, and that needs to be solved to get to price parity. But certainly startups in India, for example, are already reaching price parity on some of their products. So, you know, like Good Dot, for example, some Chinese companies are able to do that. I know Omni Pork is not as expensive per gram as Beyond Meat. So I think that these are not difficult things to solve. And it will come, but certainly affordability needs to get there. And for affordability, we need scale. And that's why we need people like the big food companies and the big fast food companies to get on board with these products, because we need the scale for the impact.
Exactly. And Sonalie, I mean, we don't want to start going too much into this topic because it becomes very complicated. But obviously, one of the aspects of well, Daniel did mention it in terms of the carbon footprint of the industry. The day we will really be calculating the true cost of carbon against the traditional food system and animal farming will become then very expensive. If you actually take into account the footprint, because I guess all these solutions you were speaking of, they are rather low carbon compared to the traditional industry. Am I correct to say so? Yeah. Probably, yeah.
I would say yes. I think Daniel could also speak a lot more on that.
Before we go to the final part of the discussion and open the floor for any questions, and so please start thinking about your questions, and don't worry if you don't have any, because I have many. But Daniel, do you have anything else to add on the challenges for the world sector and the future of food?
No, I mean, I think this is happening in a big way. Consumers pick food based on price, taste, and convenience. And plant-based has already shown that it's sort of hit that nexus. We have Beyond and Impossible and Omni in the meat space. We have Oatly in the dairy space. We don't really have those category leaders in cheese, in fish, and egg, but it's happening. So for plant-based, it's already happening. The next big frontier is, of course, the cell-based, fermentation-based, where we can get real dairy and egg and meat through bioreactors. We're getting news every day that the price is coming down significantly. Companies are ready to launch this. I spoke with Mike Selden of Finless Foods in San Francisco the other week. They're hoping to launch within 12 months. They're doing bluefin tuna grown in a bioreactor. They will be cheaper than conventional bluefin tuna, and this is a threatened, endangered species. So this is happening. Then it's just a matter of time before it scales up. Yes, there will be consumer, acceptance obstacles, regulatory obstacles, technical obstacles. So but it's a matter of time. So whether it takes 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it doesn't really matter. This is happening. So there's going to be a lot of conversation around this once these products actually launch in a big way.
Okay, great. Well, actually, you're making my job very easy, because I wanted the final part of our conversation to be an outlook and seeing how fast these things will go. So you already kind of presented it. I mean, the pace is accelerating. There's more and more money. Do you have some numbers in because I mean, every time I open and read your newsletters, guys, it's just like the list seems to be longer and longer about so much happening in the space. So many
685 startups as the last check from the GFI database globally.
Okay, say that again.
685.
685 startups.
In fermentation, cell-based and plant-based.
Okay.
Not insects, sorry, no insects in that.
Right.
No, because GFI is also animal-free. Sorry, just
okay, it's called GFI.
Good Food Institute is sort of like the alt protein, you could call them lobbyists or industry players or ecosystem, and they do research and they have a database. Again, it's not perfect. I'm sure it's missing some companies, right, Daniel? But I've looked at 7 databases in the last week just because I was doing a project, and that's the most complete list. Do you agree, Daniel?
Yeah, definitely hundreds. And it's also important to keep in mind this has boomed with like 10x just compared to 4 years ago, when there were just a handful of companies in cell-based and novel, plant-based. Now there are hundreds. So it's really booming the space. Investments are also booming. I think GFI said it was about 1 billion in 2019. Last year, $3 billion were invested into these startups. So it's definitely, there's a lot of expectations that this will capture market share, basically.
Great.
So,
is there, I mean, you would not expect it from startups, but you were mentioning a couple of category leaders, including, of course, Oatly, which is expected to go for an IPO pretty soon. But then we also have these other names already listed in the US or about to be listed. But my understanding is that none of them is profitable yet. Is it correct? And so, how long do you think it's going to take for this? For the industry as such to start seeing an emergence of leaders which are actually making money and returning money to the investors?
Well, I think they're investing a lot of money in scaling up capacity. So Oatly, for example, is building huge plants both in the US, in the UK, in Asia, and this obviously costs tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars because they're trying to satisfy demand. But I think they could easily, become profitable if they stopped expanding and basically just, started cashing in. But they're still in the growth phase. It'll take a huge amount of capex for all of these companies to make a significant dent. Impossible, I think, and this was, I checked a long time ago, but I think they produce something like 1 million pounds of plant-based meat in the US every month. The US, production of ground beef is 1 billion pounds of ground beef every month. So Impossible can meet 0.1% of demand. So this shows there's a huge sort of gap. These companies need to invest a lot in production capabilities to scale up and satisfy market demand. So it's not that they're unable to turn a profit. It's more that they're choosing right now to expand geographically and expand marketing, expand production. If I were a dairy farmer in the Western world, I'd be concerned given all the innovation that's happening. Let me put it that way.
Okay, great. All right, we've got, let's say, 10 minutes to go. So I'm officially opening up the Q&A, and I will be checking the chat if anybody, and I will be the one to relay your questions. But I have to prepared some questions. Again, I feel, I'm really privileged here being the moderator. So one question. There's one country in the world with a huge amount of the population actually being vegetarian, i.e. India. Do you see any interesting innovation startups development in India compared to, you would expect more to come from a place like India than a place like in the US, where they have the highest meat consumption per capita in the world?
I'm happy to take that if that's okay, Daniel, because I'm half Indian and spent a lot of time on the Indian.
Didn't know that.
Yeah,
great.
That's my other half. So yeah. So first of all, it's a little bit of a misunderstanding that the majority of the population is vegetarian. It's actually under 1/3 and sadly going down. But what is true is that the percentage of vegetables and plant-based food on the plate is larger as well. So, and of course, the number of meats that are eaten is much more reduced because beef is off the table for Hindus, pork is off the table for Muslims, and usually that they're just avoided in general for either or. So the menu is usually chicken and mutton, which is goat. So yeah, and their fish depends on which part of India you're in. In the north, it's not very common, but in the south and on the coastal areas, it is. So yeah, so however, India is a huge consumer of dairy, really important to understand that, and a huge consumer of eggs, right? Because Indians eat a lot of yogurt, they eat a lot of paneer, which is a curd cheese. And so yeah, so that just some baselines. There are some interesting companies in India. There is Good Do and Good Dot. So they're like joint companies. One of them makes the products, the other has stores and little kiosks all around India, and they've made a lot of progress. They've even expanded outside of India, and they have made progress distribution-wise, and they've made progress price-wise. So they're already competitive with the animal alternative. There's one company that I'm really excited about in India called Evo Foods, which is doing the mung bean plant-based egg, and they've gotten attention from around the world and been in a few accelerators, and they seem like they might be ready for launch later this year. So they would compete with, for example, Eat Just mung bean egg. It's very similar. In fact, the egg space in the plant-based egg space is very interesting. And in the last 6 months at Green Queen, we've covered at least 7 different startups around the world that are new just in the last 6 months that are going into egg. But yeah, so egg is a really important one because it's a very cheap source of protein that a lot of people in the world eat. And egg production is surprisingly cruel if you don't know much about it. Yeah, so yeah, it's pretty bad. Yeah. Okay. But I don't want to like be horrible, but yeah, if you want to look into it, yeah. People often think, oh, well, eggs, like what's the problem, but
you're killing them, yeah.
It's pretty bad. You do kill them. You kill the male chicks, in fact. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you force them to constantly be pregnant, anyway, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, we have a couple of questions here. I'll start with one question about the trends in China. Obviously, it's a huge market. Whatever happens in China has a huge impact on the world. So, specifically, the question is it a myth that Chinese middle class now sees milk and dairy as premium, showing high status? So, if you are now, you can afford it, you want to eat milk and dairy. Is that true or not? always hard to make general conclusions on China. But what do you think?
Sonalie, that's your neck of the woods, not mine.
Yeah. We are in Asia here, so
no.
go for it.
No. Daniel is super well versed on everything. I think China's super interesting because, like with any other major economy in Asia, and I wouldn't discount Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand, when China decides to do something, oh boy, like look out, right? And the Chinese government has a different view on how they look at things, and they're very macro in their view. So going back to Daniel's kind of macro introduction, they are very aware of the externality risks of the current food system, and they're very aware that meat consumption is going up, and they're very aware that that's going to make them very dependent on places like Brazil and the United States. So they definitely are putting behind the scenes, there is government backing and support for this new food economy. So that's definitely happening. And in China, it tends to be the big players. So the big food companies have now all come out with their own plant-based food lines in the last 2 years. I was showing a map of Chinese startups that has just come out in the last couple of months, and it's literally, the increase is 20-fold from a year ago. So it's just the acceleration happening there. It's there. I mean, the young startups are, really excited. They're seeing what's happening around the world, and they're getting involved, and they want to make products that are fit for their own, their own cuisines. The government is definitely in the back supporting. I think we believe that China will be one of the other places in the world where there'll be commercialization for cell-based meat at an earlier stage than maybe in other parts of the world. And yeah, I would say Israel, China, Singapore, these were our our kind of, when we did the Asia Alt Protein report last January, we predicted Singapore, China, and then Singapore happened. I would say China, it's a strong case because it makes sense, right? Because the thing that people need to understand about cell-based meat is that it localizes your food production for protein, right? And it doesn't require as much land as localizing animal growing. So it's really huge for national security and food security. And after a year like the one we've had, or a year and a half going on 2 years, where there was a moment in time where borders were closed across the world, hey, national security and food security are starting to sound really linked. Right, Daniel? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. I think another aspect about what's going on in China is, of course, China, like many other countries in the world, have now decarbonization targets. But the dairy industry, I'm back to this issue on carbon. I mean, we as an equity asset fund manager, we do carbon footprint analysis in our portfolios, and our China Asia fund, the number 3 is a dairy. And they would put pressure on anybody with anything. Well, actually, we have another very interesting question this time from Paul, and we've been talking a lot about startups and the venture cap space, but could you elaborate a bit on what the big players' roles are in food tech? So the Tyson Food of this world, the big guys, because they are probably thinking they are being disrupted, but at the same time, we actually want them to start investing into that space. So can you share with us your view on that?
I can start.
Please do.
They're definitely aware of what's going on. Most of them have VC arms, Tyson, for example, and they are making bets in both plant-based, cell-based, fermentation-based companies. Tyson was an early investor in Beyond Meat, for example. They divested before the IPO and then launched their own line. And Tyson, by the way, said, if you can produce, their CEO said, if you can produce meat without an animal, why wouldn't we? And sort of redefine themselves to a protein company from a meat company, and they're one of the largest one on the planet. I think the big companies are aware of what's going on. They are investing, both making acquisitions or trying to develop their own brands. The question is how authentic these brands are. So they're aware of what's going on and are trying not to get have a Blockbuster moment when Blockbuster said, Netflix is not on our radar, and then 3 years later, Blockbuster went bankrupt. So, or something like that. So they're definitely a very much, I'd say, active, but they're not leading the development. I think the actual hard R&D and the work on the ground is done by small and scrappy startups, especially in the US, Israel, Singapore, other places. There are a couple of hotspots. And obviously, these startups are partnering with large actors to scale up because they need capital, because they need production capability. Perfect Day Food, mentioned earlier, they produce whey and casein protein for milk in bioreactors. They partnered with Archer Downing Midlands, ADM, because they have huge bioreactor facilities. So I think we'll see more of that partnering, where the startups bring the innovation and the big companies bring the capital and distribution, production capabilities.
Okay, great. Okay, guys, we again, I had many other questions, but clearly I won't have the time to take them. So I'm going to have just one final question. And by the way, in case you haven't noticed, this webinar is being recorded, so you are on record. I'm going to ask this question. I just recently read in Bloomberg Green that the global meat production, which used to be 200 million tons in 1995, peaked actually last year at 400 million tons. So I'm asking each of you, in 5 years' time, where is it? So it's 400 million tons today. Where is it in 5 years' time?
There's two divergent trends going on, because you have as people in the world, the middle class is growing, people urbanize, they do adopt the Western diet, which means more animal source food consumption. So yes, that's one mega trend. On the other hand, you have people in the Western world looking to change their diets for various reasons: health, environment, animal welfare, climate, and so on. So 10 years out, I do think in the Western world, consumption of animal source protein will be down, and sort of alternative proteins will be up quite a bit. We've seen that with Oatly and Impossible and Beyond. So I don't think their trajectory will stop. It'll take some time before these products and innovations reach emerging markets for various reasons. So we might be a bit off from sort of peak meat, but I think it will happen in the next 10, 20 years. Okay, but give me a number, Daniel. In 5 years' time, if we have 400 million today, and Sonalie, she's been thinking hard on now giving me an answer. I just want a number. 400 million today, what is it in 5 years' time? I don't think it will keep increasing in Western countries. I think it will start decreasing in Western countries because we're getting really great plant-based, fermentation-based, cell-based options. If they just pass regulatory, I really think they will capture a lot of market share. So we might have seen peak animal source food consumption in Western countries, but it takes time to scale up these innovations. Yes, you still don't want to give me a number. Okay, I see. No. So Sonalie, you're brave. You're the green queen. Do you have a number for me?
I don't know if I'm brave, and I am a cynic. I think probably the best we can do in 5 years is probably 300. Okay. Just because, as Daniel pointed out, in order for that to go down to like 100 or 50, we need Africa, South America, and Asia to leapfrog over industrial meat scaling and go straight to the alternatives. No, and we're all aware of, I mean, we've been covering all these topics today about, again, affordability, about how much investment, how much vested interest and controversies and everything. But you gave us a number, 300 million, and that's the number we will remember. And we will remember Daniel didn't give us a number. No, I'm joking. No. Anyway, no, on this happy note, I want to say thank you so much for everybody was joined to listen. Thank you, a huge applaud, and thank you to Daniel and Sonalie. And thank you to Sweatsham to organize this. This is just a start. We are happy to discuss this further, and also, of course, everyone to subscribe to your newsletter. So it's called Food Week, Daniel, and then we have the Green Queen. With very, very interesting always information and news flows about a space where a lot is happening. On this note, thank you so much. Have a good day or the rest of the afternoon. Bye-bye.